I was born in 1946, so I doubt if I would actually have seen this 1951 magazine ad for the Santa Fe Railroad's Super Chief Extra Luxurious Trains. Starting in 1936, they made regular long-distance trips from Chicago to Los Angeles. They had all the nicest amenities, including separate sleeping rooms, fancy dining car with gourmet food, and more. For decades, the Santa Fe billed its Super Chief as the train of the stars, because so many movie stars preferred to travel in its luxury when making trips from Hollywood to back east. In fact, a number of movies had scenes filmed inside Super Chief cars, but I wouldn't have known anything about that at age 5. Even earlier than that, I wouldn't have seen this ad from 1947, focusing on the dining experience on the Santa Fe's trains. The young cowpoke is certainly impressed with what he can see of passengers enjoying a meal in the train's dining car through the windows of the train paused at the station where he's hanging out with his dad somewhere in the U.S. Southwest. Nor would I have seen this close-up look at the dining experience in the Super Chief in a 1951 magazine ad. And since it was the year I was born when this famous painting by Norman Rockwell made the cover of a 1946 Saturday Evening Post, I would not have seen it either. It depicts a young traveler probably making a train trip to visit family somewhere, trying very hard to mentally calculate how much he needs to leave as a tip for the nice African-American waiter who was beaming down on him kindly. So why do you suppose I can distinctly remember wistfully yearning as a small child to be able to take a train trip? I don't even remember ever seeing a passenger train pass by on a track near a highway when going somewhere in the car with my parents. I had never been at a train station to meet some family member coming to visit. Without any real-world experience with trains, what could have spurred such yearning? I'm pretty sure it was this. I'm pretty sure that at age 5 I had a copy of this book, published in 1951. Obviously lots of people my age had a copy too, and kept them for a long time, because I found numerous vintage copies available for sale on used book sites on the web just now. In the book, 2 young siblings named Bill and Kay have been visiting their aunt on the East Coast. To get back to their parents and home on the West Coast, they take a wonderful train ride that lasts 3 days. Yes, it is somewhat shocking to see small children unaccompanied by an adult on such an adventure these days, but evidently it wasn't that uncommon back in the 1940s. I guess the train staff was expected to keep an eye on them. Almost every adult remembers Simon & Schuster's iconic line of inexpensive children's books, sold under the brand of Golden Books. First published in 1942, they are still around and selling well. Well, they had competition. Rand McNally published Rand McNally Elf books from 1947 to 1986. The Wonderful Train Ride was an elf book. Many of them were simple stories about inquisitive children like this, experiencing visits to farms and airports and such. One seller on the web had a few photos to show of the inside pages of the book, including a montage of several aspects of their train trip. Looks like they were even allowed to take a peek in the train's mail sorting car and in the kitchen where the yummy meals were being prepared. Strangely enough, I also found what appeared to be the exact same book, but with a different train engine on the cover, a sleek, streamlined train with a bullet-shaped engine, published in 1947. Looking at inside photos and the text, it became clear that it was the exact same book, with the kids wearing the same clothes, but posed differently on the cover. That montage shown earlier was in the older book, and as you'll notice, even included an illustration of the streamlined bullet engine to go along with the text. In the new book, they didn't bother to replace it with that red and yellow one from the cover. Although this is not so strange when you note just what sort of engine was on the 1951 book cover. Although the Santa Fe Railroad logo was missing from the front of the engine on the book cover, The shape and coloration of the engine on the book cover is obviously identical to the one in the magazine ad here. The magazine ad was touting all sorts of new improvements that had made the Super Chief line even more fabulous than ever. Included was what they called pleasure domes. The pleasure domes were lounge dining cars. A second level of comfortable swivel seats was raised above the top of the car, covered with a glass dome, so you could see the scenery of the fabulous Southwest as you passed it by. Down below this was a luxurious lounge area where you could get cocktails and such. And for an added touch, the lounge had a private dining area named the Turquoise Room, which was available by reservation only and could seat 12 for private dinner parties. And so it appears to me that the publishers of the children's book decided to ride piggyback on all that Super Chief advertising in 1951 in order to sell more books, and turn its train on the cover into one with the iconic red and yellow Super Chief engine to catch the eye of parents and encourage them to buy the book for their children. I think what intrigued me the most in my little elf book was this photo of the children eating lunch in the dining car. It seemed amazing to me as a little child that if I went on such a train trip, I could sit at a fancy big dining table complete with flowers in a vase without any adults, and be waited on by a dignified waiter who would take my order and make sure I got everything I asked for, and at the same time be able to sit by a window and watch all the pretty scenery pass by. Yes, I was sure eating on a train trip would be the most glamorous experience I could have in life at that age. Which makes me wonder what little kids in the mid-1800s who actually got to go on such a train trip would have thought of their dining experience. Have a look at what eating on a train trip was like in about 1865. Although dining cars had been invented by then, most trains didn't have them. The technology had not yet been figured out that would be necessary for passengers to go from car to car on a moving train. So if you were sitting in a passenger compartment and got hungry, there would be no way for you to make your way to the dining car. Thus, most trains relied on seeing that people got fed on long trips by making restaurants or lunchrooms available in their train stations, just like the one you see here in a humorous illustration from about 1865. At breakfast, lunch, and dinner time, the train would stop at a station along the way to get more water for the engine, and the passengers were allowed to get off the train to get a meal while waiting. Except, trains were always in a hurry to get to their ultimate destination on time, so you as a passenger weren't allowed a leisurely amount of time to eat. The standard was about 15 minutes or so. You didn't sit down and order a meal to your liking and wait for it to be cooked and then eat it. You ate whatever food was in the planned meal of the day at the station, which would be shoveled onto a plate and shoved in front of you so that you could gobble it down before the clanging signal rang out to tell you to get back on the train, lest you be left behind. Most people couldn't even finish their meal before time was up, so plenty of food was left on plates. As disgusting as the thought is, it was not at all uncommon for the restaurant staff to pick up plates with half-eaten food and scrape the leftovers onto a fresh plate and save it to serve someone in the next crowd that dashed into the station. And being honest, even the food when freshly made was often pretty unpalatable. Most stations were not near farming areas, especially those in the southwest U.S. where the Santa Fe railroad lines ran. Fresh fruits and vegetables were non-existent on the menu. If there were any fruits or vegetables at all, they were canned. And you might think, being out in cattle country in places like Kansas, there'd be plenty of fresh beef, so you could at least have a nice steak. But no, Kansas was where you raised cattle, not where you slaughtered them. Slaughterhouses were not common in the small towns along the Santa Fe line in the early years. Cows were herded up once a year and shipped off by train to Chicago for slaughtering and butchering, and then the meat sent back by train to towns to be sold by local stores. By the time it was served in restaurants, it wasn't that uncommon for it to begin to stink or even have maggots. Back in that era, the New York Times had this to say about eating the food at railway stations. If there is any word in the English language more shamefully misused than another, it is the word refreshment, as applied to the hurry-scurry of eating and drinking at railroad stations. Directors of railroads appear to have an idea that travelers are destitute of stomach, that eating and drinking are not at all necessary to human beings bound on long journeys, and that nothing more is required than to put them through their misery in as brief a time as possible. It is expected that 300 or 400 men, women, and children can be whirled half a day over a dusty road with hot cinders flying in their faces, and then when they approach a station and are dying of weariness, hunger, and thirst, longing for an opportunity to bathe their faces at least before partaking of their much-needed refreshments, that they shall rush helter-skelter into a dismal long dining room and dispatch a supper, breakfast, or dinner in 15 minutes. The consequences of such savage and unnatural feeding are not reported by telegraph as railroad disasters, but if a faithful account were given of them, we are afraid they would be found much more serious than any that are caused by smashing of cars or the breaking down of bridges. I never did get that luxurious experience of taking a train trip on a classy train like the one I saw in my little book. By the time I read The Wonderful Train Ride, my family, like most others, had their own automobile, and family road trips in the auto were how most families traveled. In the early years, it was before fast food places like McDonald's were widely available, so we ate most of our meals on trips through the 1950s in what were often called greasy spoon diners along highways like Route 66. The only time I took a train anywhere, it was on Amtrak for a short distance sometime in the 2000s. And it didn't look a thing like that classy Super Chief. It looked like this photo, which is the inside of a modern Amtrak coach car. In other words, this was exactly like riding in a bus. As for food, seems like I remember a lady coming around offering pre-packaged cold sandwiches to buy and bags of chips. Yes, that is the way of modern trains. But this series is about the way it used to be, in the heyday of the glamorous railway trips, and how Fred Harvey made that way possible. And that all started when Fred Harvey shook hands on a business agreement with Charlie Morse, superintendent of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, sometime in late fall 1875. As described in the previous episode of this series, there was no contract, just the word of two honest men that things would go the way they agreed. Although the official name of the railroad was the full Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad at the time, from very early on it was commonly called just the Santa Fe. We'll use that shorter name from now on through this series to make things simple. Their agreement stated that Fred could take over management of the 20-seat lunchroom on the second floor of the railroad's depot in Topeka, Kansas. It was a generous agreement indeed for Fred. He got the space rent-free. The Santa Fe would cover all the utilities, pay for all the kitchen equipment, and even provide free transportation on Santa Fe trains for Fred's employees and all the provisions of food Fred might order from out of town to make into meals for the restaurant. On Fred's side, he'd have to pay for the food and labor, and for any improvements he wanted to make to the eating area, such as furniture and tableware. But after that, all profits would go to Fred. It was a sweet deal, but the stakes were high for him to deliver a superior dining experience that would impress Santa Fe customers and Santa Fe management, because the main operations office for the whole railroad line was right across the street from the depot. Bigwigs from that office would no doubt be eating at Fred's restaurant regularly. Fred was up to the challenge, and the restaurant opened the first week of January 1876. Stephen Fry had this to say about the opening in his bio of Fred Harvey titled Appetite for America. The opening of Fred Harvey's lunchroom in the Santa Fe Depot in Topeka would later be touted as a major turning point in culinary history, perfectly timed for the beginning of America's centennial year. There is an oft-repeated story that the lunchroom was such an overnight success that the railroad feared western migration itself might be halted because nobody wanted to go past Topeka once they tasted Fred Harvey's food. But in fact, success did not come quite so quickly or easily. The Santa Fe lunchroom did get a nice little write-up in the Leavenworth Times on January 5, 1876, describing the eatery as the neatest, cleanest dining hall in the state, everything brand new. The crockery, cutlery, and silverware of the choicest patterns, and the tables supplied in the best of style. It was a luxury to sit down to such a table. A man who takes such pains to serve the public ought to be rewarded with liberal patronage. Fred opened his lunchroom for business just months before the opening in Philadelphia of the Centennial Exhibition, a World's Fair hosted by the U.S. to show off all its progress of its first 100 years, and to allow 37 other nations to bring exhibits of their own achievements in industry, the arts, and development of natural resources. It was a celebration of the nation that drew 10 million visitors to Philadelphia. The high point was on July 4th, 1876, when the Declaration of Independence was read aloud from the steps of the building where it was originally signed. Right after the 1776 Declaration was read, notorious suffragette Susan B. Anthony arose from the audience and unexpectedly strode up front to the stage and handed her own declaration to the President of the Senate, who was sitting on the platform. It was the Declaration of Rights for Women. She then walked down from the stage and went to the front of Independence Hall and read it out loud to the crowd that gathered around her. It ended with the words, "We, therefore, women of the United States of America, do solemnly publish and declare that we are by nature, and of right ought to be by law, free and independent citizens, possessing equal political power with our brother men." As mentioned in the previous episode of this series, Fred Harvey had a direct connection to Susan B. Anthony, as her brother Daniel was the mayor of Leavenworth, where the Harvey family was living in the early 1870s. As the Harveys schmoozed with many folks in circles in which Daniel traveled, they would have schmoozed with Susan on occasions when she came to town to visit. No, Fred Harvey didn't make it to the Centennial Exhibition, and he didn't hear Susan's declaration when she read it to the crowd there on July 4th. The July 4th celebration had been a joyous affair, leaving the crowds at the exhibition in high spirits, full of pride in their country. But just days later, the mood turned very dark. Newspaper reports began arriving that carried news of a tragic major event that occurred just days before in southeastern Montana Territory. And it did happen to have a direct connection to Fred Harvey back in Leavenworth, Kansas, home to Fort Leavenworth, the primary outpost for U.S. military actions west of the Missouri River. The news reports were about a major battle, later dubbed the Battle of the Little Bighorn, because it was fought alongside the Little Bighorn River on June 25th and June 26th. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, had attacked a Native American encampment of combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. A perfect storm of misjudgments by Custer and his advisors over a period of days had concluded the number of natives was relatively small. They were all wrong. Under the guidance of major leaders, including Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, there were well over 1,000 native men ready to fight. At the end of the battle, 5 of the cavalry's 12 companies were totally wiped out. That included George Custer, 2 of his brothers, a nephew, and a brother-in-law. The total U.S. casualty count was 268 dead and 55 severely wounded. Later generations referred to the battle as Custer's Last Stand. As you would correctly assume, this was viewed by most Americans and greatly hyped by the U.S. press as being a heinous act by the villainous Indians against a great American hero. But here's what Harvey biographer Stephen Fried had to say about the situation. In the Eastern press coverage of Custer's last stand, there was no question that the Indians were villains and an American hero had been felled. Where the Harveys lived, however, the issue of Little Bighorn was more complicated. In Leavenworth, Custer's legacy was more ambiguous, and the Indian question was still a question. The Harveys knew the Custers, who had lived on and off at the fort for years and were active on the city's social scene. So they were well aware that Custer had once been court-martialed in Leavenworth for deserting his command, taking 75 soldiers to work on his own personal business matters, and then ordering the execution of 3 supposed deserters who were shot without a trial. And the cause for which he and his troops had given their lives at Little Bighorn was also controversial. The government has sent Custer to roust the Sioux out of the Black Hills where gold had been discovered. But that land originally had been given to the Indians in a treaty. It was only after the economic downturn that Washington had decided to take it back by force if necessary. In Leavenworth, there were powerfully mixed feelings about the government's Indian policy. The fort was still the place from which troops were deployed for the Indian Wars, and many of the casualties, including those from Little Bighorn, were buried in Leavenworth's National Cemetery. Tribal leaders were often incarcerated at the fort prison, and there was certainly a great deal of bigotry. But people in Leavenworth saw friendly Indians on the street every day, mostly from the large and peaceful Potawatomi reservation nearby. Fred and many others did business with the local tribal leaders through Enoch Hoag, the government's superintendent for Indian Affairs in Kansas. In fact, Indians were sometimes among the many customers trying out the new and improved Santa Fe eating house in Topeka. Not long after Little Bighorn, a group of 96 Sioux stopped for lunch. Local newspaper coverage of the event wasn't particularly kind. People were a little disappointed upon seeing them, for all expected to see them in their war costume, with their bloody tomahawks and dripping scalping knives. Upon arriving at the depot, a number of bucks with 10 buckets made a break for the eating house, where they got hot coffee and returned to their cars, where they partook of their frugal meal, which consisted of boiled beef without seasoning and coffee. They gorge themselves when they eat. They all eat out of the same pan and drink coffee out of the same can. This is the reason they are not allowed to go into hotels to eat. They don't know how to behave themselves. However, a few of the big Injuns were allowed the privilege of sitting at the white man's table. Messrs. Spotted Tail, Red Dog, and Fast Bear were taken to the railroad eating house, where they partook of double rations. They got away with everything set before them. In fact, everything that was within reach. They exhibited some of the traits of a human by using knives and forks and blowing their coffee to cool it. They also mopped their mouths with napkins, which they forgot to put in their pockets after using. Mr. Tail understood the use of knives and forks. He held the piece with a fork while he severed it with the knife, and with his fingers he placed the largest piece of the knife and dumped it into his mouth. Mr. Dog wiped off his gooms with his tongue after eating enough for 3 big men like John Carter. But old Pat Bear gave the crowd away. After getting up from the table, he reached over and grabbed up all the apples he could hold in his big hands, which were about 4 apiece, probably under the sweet impression he was stealing them. The reporter was particularly outraged by the way the local women interacted with the Indians. Some of the ladies at the depot considered it a great honor to grasp these dusky murderers of the plains by the hand, he wrote. Red Dog was so struck with the beauty of a lady there that he returned to the room to get a look at her. While it was possible to encounter diners of almost any ethnicity and occupation at Fred's lunchroom in Topeka, Russian Mennonites on their way to start farms, Chinese laborers heading west to lay tracks, German Jews hoping to start businesses in the new towns, veterans of both sides of the Civil War, cowboys, and Indians. It didn't mean that everyone got along. Sometimes the only thing they all agreed on was Fred Harvey's coffee. what was so special about Fred Harvey's coffee? Number one was that from the Topeka restaurant to all the other Fred Harvey establishments that were added to the chain over the following decades, Fred Harvey served only a special blend roasted exclusively for Fred's businesses by Caleb Chase and James Sanborn. The freshly ground coffee was shipped directly from the Chase and Sanborn in Boston. And number two, the Chase and Sanborn coffee served by Fred Harvey restaurants was brewed fresh every 2 hours. Harvey houses never reheated coffee to be served. They dumped out whatever was left in the brewing pots at the end of 2 hours and started a new batch. Yes, as mentioned earlier, this little arrangement between the Santa Fe Railroad for Fred to manage the Topeka lunchroom was, as seen from the distant future, the start of something big. But let's be clear, it didn't fast-track Fred to a prosperous future. Fred was still overseeing those 3 eating houses on the Kansas Pacific Railroad that he had arranged earlier, even as he started the new venture in Topeka and continued it for 2 years. He was also continuing to sell freight for the Burlington Railroad. You might say Fred had a natural talent for multitasking or juggling. In 1877, Fred and Sally's third child and second son, Byron, was born. And later that year, Fred was chomping at the bit to multitask more. Because there were exciting shakeups in the business of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Company that promised greater opportunities than Fred had imagined when he just asked about the Topeka Depot restaurant. Up until 1877, many Texas cattlemen had driven their herds north to Kansas to the livestock pens of the Kansas Pacific Railroad every fall. From there, they would be shipped to the stockyards of Chicago, where they would be slaughtered and the meat sold to markets in the east. Before the 1877 roundup, when the herds would be brought north, the Santa Fe Railroad built large cattle pens and a livestock shipping center at its station in tiny Dodge City, Kansas. That was 100 miles closer to Texas cattle country than the Kansas Pacific site, 100 miles less that cowboys would have to drive the herds. And since cattle drives covered about 10 miles a day, that would cut off over a week from the drive. At the same time, the Santa Fe cut their shipping prices below the Kansas Pacific. Suddenly, many Texas cattlemen chose to switch railroads for their business and bolstered the profitability of the Santa Fe greatly. It also sparked a boom in businesses of other kinds in Little Dodge City. In 1871, there was nothing on the site of the future Dodge City but a single sod house west of Fort Dodge, built by a cattleman named Sittler to oversee cattle operations in the region. It was near the Santa Fe Trail and Arkansas River, and Sittler's house quickly became a stopping point for travelers. When the Santa Fe Railroad began building tracks from the east directly toward the spot, and investors in the region realized there was going to be a great potential for both the cattle business and other commercial enterprises, they staked out the land for a town. The town was platted, and George M. Hoover established the first bar in a tent to serve thirsty soldiers from Fort Dodge, a military fort about 5 miles away. The railroad arrived in September 1877 to find a town ready and waiting for business. The early settlers in Dodge City traded in buffalo bones and hides and provided a civilian community for Fort Dodge. However, with the arrival of the railroad, Dodge City soon became involved in the cattle trade. And the little town exploded. It became famous in American Old West legends for such places as the Long Branch Saloon, shown in the center of this photo. A fictionalized version of the Long Branch was the centerpiece of the Gunsmoke TV show, with Miss Kitty offered on the TV as respectable part owner in the saloon. The creator of the original radio version of the show admitted that her role on the radio, although never affirmed out loud, was of a prostitute, perhaps even the madam of a brothel. It also became famous for such lawmen and gunslingers as Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Doc Holliday. That's Bat Masterson, third from the left in the back row. Wyatt Earp, second from the left in the front row. Although it did get a legendary reputation as being a place with endless gunfights, actually, as you can see from the sign in the middle of the main street in Dodge from that era, open or concealed carrying of guns in the town was forbidden. The law said that anyone entering the town was to personally turn over any firearm to the sheriff, and just like checking the code at a restaurant, he would be given a token that he could use at the end of his stay in town to retrieve his weapon. Obviously, not every desperado went along with that law, so there were indeed some gunfights in the town. You might remember hearing of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. Wyatt and his brother Virgil Earp and Doc Holliday had moved along from Dodge City to Tombstone by then, and were involved in that episode. Tombstone had the same kind of firearms prohibited law. The OK Corral incident was allegedly triggered by the fact that Ike Clanton and his buddies were ordered to turn over their weapons by Deputy U.S. Marshal Virgil for safekeeping, and they decided instead to defy the order. But in spite of that infamous episode and some others, gunfights were not nearly as frequent as one might suppose, based on movies about the Old West. But back to our main focus of this video, Fred Harvey. He was really excited when he heard about the Santa Fe tracks being pushed farther and farther across Kansas, promising growth that could turn into business for Fred. But even more importantly, shortly after that, the Santa Fe rocked the Western railroad business world by luring a young executive named William Barstow Strong from his job at the Burlington Railroad Company and made him the new general manager of the Santa Fe Company. Strong had a dynamic reputation as being an extremely talented, bold, and effective executive. Stephen Fried explained what this meant for the Santa Fe and for Fred Harvey. By hiring Strong, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe signaled that it would no longer be content as just another successful regional line. Its leaders hoped to extend the railroad, which currently ran from Kansas only as far as La Junta, Colorado, not just to Santa Fe, New Mexico, but all the way to the Pacific, competing with the other big transcontinental players. But unlike those players who had gone from business heroes to robber barons after the 1873 market crash, the Santa Fe planned to be the white hat in Western railroading, trying to build without scandals or government subsidies. They would be the good guys, the independent railroad, and they thought Strong was the man who could take them to that next level. He immediately laid out plans to aggressively expand the AT&SF's west through Colorado to the Pacific. And within days of his arrival at the Santa Fe's main operations office in Topeka, Fred Harvey was there, negotiating with the railroad to take over more eating houses in Kansas, starting with Florence, the most important restaurant and hotel on the line. So how did Fred pick the Florence depot as his next target? Florence was the primary meal stop for AT&SF passengers in eastern Kansas and also attracted sportsmen, since the hunting and fishing nearby were spectacular. Taking over the operation there was complicated because the Santa Fe, as an experiment, had actually sold its eating house and depot hotel to a local entrepreneur rather than leasing it. The railroad had the right to replace him, but only if he was bought out. And at the moment, the Santa Fe was cash poor because every dollar was being spent on new tracks in Colorado. Strong told Fred he could run the Florence Eating House and Hotel, but only if he laid out all the money himself to purchase the building and its contents. The price was $5,275, equal today to $117,488, more than half of his life savings. The Santa Fe promised to buy the Florence building back and to let him manage it rent-free like Topeka when conditions improved. It was a huge gamble for Fred, who was accustomed to seeking leveraged comfort in more conservative investments. But William Strong had a way of daring associates to be great. As you can see from this modern map, Florence, at the bottom left of the map, was about 100 miles southwest of Topeka. At the standard railroad train rate at the time of 25 miles per hour, it would have taken about 4 hours to travel from Topeka to Florence. It wasn't a round trip you'd want to make in a single day, but it would have been acceptable if you had a nice hotel to stay in Florence, which is exactly what Fred Harvey had in mind making available. Fred accepted the gamble to invest in the Florence facility. Some folks were of the opinion that the food at the Florence restaurant before Fred came was basically inedible, which was very unfortunate since it was such a major stop on the Santa Fe line at the time. Evidently, Strong was convinced Fred could do his magic act on the Florence Hotel and restaurant the way he had done the Topeka Depot. And he wasn't wrong. Almost immediately after Fred took over the restaurant, the local newspaper reported that they didn't even know the name of the new proprietor yet, but he wasn't even passing out business cards yet. But from their point of view, quote, "He sets a square meal all the same. Everybody takes breakfast and supper there." It probably wasn't any real magic by Fred. It was shrewd risk-taking. Since he saw that the bosses of the Santa Fe were making all sorts of daring decisions and moves, he decided to go all out and do so too. Mind you, Florence had only been incorporated as a town in 1871, and that was only because a group of men in the county learned that the Santa Fe Railroad was building rail lines toward the area. They found out where the train would cross the local Cottonwood River and concluded that spot would be ideal for a town that would grow because of the railroad. By the time Fred was ready to take over the hotel and restaurant, about 1878, Florence was still a town of barely 800 people that no one outside of the immediate area, other than the occasional hunting club, would ever visit unless they had to. It wasn't a destination. It was just a strategic stop for a short break in a long train trip, for the engine to take on water, and the travelers and railway men to grab a bite to eat. Fred could have treated it that way, just as he had the Topeka station. But Fred was beginning to hit his stride in his drive towards his destiny, and he chose to go a different route. He decided to turn the Florence establishment into a sort of boutique hotel with a destination restaurant. He wanted people to be eager to come on the train for a 2-day round trip from Topeka and other locations to Florence just to experience his hotel and restaurant. But for that, he needed a big-name chef, one from the culinary world of the East. He chose a chef named William H. Bill Phillips, who was originally from England and was trained in European cooking at the Cardiff Arms Hotel in Wales before moving to America. Remember that 1876 Centennial celebration in Philadelphia? Phillips made his mark in the news by literally, personally, organizing the feeding of 500,000 people during the celebration. A massive temporary hotel named the Globe had been erected right outside the fairgrounds to meet the needs of the huge crowds expected over the 6 months of the fair. The Globe had 1,000 rooms, and most people staying there ate there. Phillips was the food manager of that establishment throughout the fair. Once the fair was over and the Globe permanently closed down, Phillips moved on to one of the top jobs in the whole world of hotel hospitality. He was running the food service at the elegant Palmer House in Chicago. Wikipedia describes the Palmer House of that era this way. The Palmer House Hotel, completed in 1875, was 7 stories tall. Its amenities included oversized hotel rooms, luxurious decor, and sumptuous meals served in grand style. There was a tropical garden on the roof, a huge reading room, a huge parlor for visiting with friends, family, and business associates. The floor of its barbershop was tiled, and silver dollars were embedded in a diamond pattern. The Palmer House was the city's first hotel with elevators, and the first hotel with electric light bulbs and telephones in the guest rooms. Constructed mainly of iron and brick, the hotel was widely advertised as the world's only fireproof hotel. Famous visitors included presidential hopefuls James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, Ulysses S. Grant, William Jennings Bryan, and William McKinley, writers Mark Twain, L. Frank Baum, who wrote Wizard of Oz, and Oscar Wilde, and actress Sarah Bernhardt. An 1895 meeting at the hotel of faculty representatives from various Midwestern universities resulted in the founding of the Big Ten Conference. So here you go. This is a photo of the train station hotel and restaurant in Florence, Kansas, next to a photo of the main dining room at the Palmer House. Fred Harvey met Bill Phillips at the Palmer in New York and suggested he, Grand Master of the culinary experience at one of the top metropolitan hotels in the world, with the finest of amenities and most exotic cuisine, attracting famous clientele in politics and the arts, agree to leave Chicago and his cushy job and travel to a town of 800 and set up shop in this little ticky-tacky building next to a railroad track at the edge of the western wilderness of America. So after being used to having the power and prestige of being head of such an auspicious venue, you'd think the answer would be a resounding no. But if so, you'd be underestimating the instincts of Fred Harvey, who expected and got a yes. Stephen Fried, in his bio of Fred, doesn't seem to think Fred succeeded in pulling off capturing Phillips by magic or hypnotism. Fried had another explanation. Fred lured Bill Phillips to Florence with the same inducements still used today to entice chefs to leave large institutions for improbable specialty ventures: the promise of a large salary and the freedom to create an oasis in his own image. Together they began inventing the standards of cuisine, efficiency, and hygiene that Fred Harvey would impose throughout the West. And it would seem that Phillips had impeccable instincts of his own. Bill Phillips seemed to realize the possibilities in Fred's visions. He joined forces with Fred for several years and expanded his own resume thereby. I happened to find this news article online from 1882 from an industry publication of the time called the Hotel World. It reads this way. At Newton, on the line of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, the new hotel, The Arcade, was opened May 18th by a banquet in the Newton Commandery Knights Templar. The Arcade is the latest addition to Fred Harvey's chain of depot hotels, but is much larger, having 80 guest rooms, and is a very handsome brick building, and very convenient to business, so that it is expected to become at once the leading and only first-class hotel in the place. Mr. W. H. Phillips is the resident manager, having resigned as general superintendent of Mr. Harvey's eating houses to become manager of the new hotel. The opening was a brilliant success in every way, and the evening proved a very enjoyable one to all who participated. The tables were arranged in the form of a cross and were loaded with viands prepared under the personal care of Mr. Phillips himself, than whom there is no better chef in the country. The ornamental pieces and confectionery were made in or trimmed with forms emblematic of the order. The menu consisted of 2 cards in the forms of a trowel, united at the handle with a knot of a silk ribbon. Notice its reference to the fact there was no better chef in the country than William Phillips, even though he was at this point, according to the article, starting to run a new Harvey Hotel in Newton, Kansas, a small town north of Wichita, about 30 miles southwest of Florence. By this time, the Santa Fe had extended its rail lines from Florence to Newton, and Newton happened to be at the time the main endpoint for the famous Chisholm Trail, bringing cattle to the Santa Fe Railroad's new station at Newton in order to be shipped to Chicago. It wasn't a metropolitan area, but I would suppose Phillips was in total control to create the new hotel in his own image as he had the one in Florence. Here's what Newton looked like in 1872. But I suppose by 1882, when Phillips took over the new Arcade Hotel, it had grown a bit. As shown in these photos, the Arcade Hotel, which housed a Harvey House restaurant also, is much more substantial than those almost wooden shanty buildings making up Main Street in Newton in 1872. But it's still kind of hard to conceive that Bill Phillips was so thrilled to be in charge that he didn't miss the glamour and majestic presence and size of the Palmer House. The picture on the right is of the whole Santa Fe station, hotel, and restaurant complex. The picture on the left shows the entry to the Harvey House restaurant that was on one end of the long building. But back to Florence in 1878. Once Fred and Bill shook hands on their joint venture to take over the Florence Hotel and Restaurant, they got busy upgrading everything. Together, they began developing the high standards of cuisine, staff efficiency, and impeccable hygiene that became the hallmark of all of the Fred Harvey restaurants, railroad dining cars, and hotels throughout the West from then on. The photo on the left here is a modern photo of a portion of the Florence Hotel that was restored and turned into a local Fred Harvey museum. On the right is the restored Harvey House dining room from the hotel as it was in the 1800s. The dining room couldn't begin to compare with even a small corner of the elegant restaurants Phillips had been employed by in the past. But he and Fred were determined to make their scaled-down version as classy as possible out in the middle of nowhere. They ordered Irish table linen straight from Belfast, Ireland, china and stemware from London, and silver-plated serving pieces from Sheffield, England. As for the menu itself, they spared no expense while carefully keeping the end cost to the customer within reason. The Florence area was famous for hunting, especially for quail and grouse, and famous for fishing, every sort of fish imaginable from bass, pike, and carp to catfish weighing up to 100 pounds. Phillips offered to pay premium prices to local fishermen and hunters for the best of their catch, to use in creating a new way of eating in the Old West. European cooking styles applied to the vast variety of meats available in the U.S. Many hotel guests were hunters and fishermen, and Bill Phillips encouraged them to bring their day's catch to him in the restaurant to allow him to turn it into the featured meat dish of a personalized feast, with side dishes and trimmings to share with their companions. Same thing about farm products. Williams offered premium prices to local farmers for the best of their harvest. Travelers through the Old West had always had to settle for very limited fruits and vegetables on restaurant menus, and almost all of it canned. Harvey House restaurants over the years, starting in Florence, prided themselves on always offering a wide variety of fresh fruits and vegetables on their menus, often shipped by rail from faraway places, prepared in often unique, delicious ways. So, how well did this expense and attention to detail go over with customers? Stephen Fried shared a story of one very impressed customer. The first major press coverage of the resurrected Florence Depot Hotel, beyond the praises of the local Herald, appeared in London. A sporting newspaper called The Field had an American correspondent, Samuel Nugent Townsend, who roamed the West seeking ecstatic experiences in shooting, fishing, and eating, and then filing ludicrously overwritten reports under the pseudonym St. Kames. He was so taken by the cuisine and comforts of Fred's new hotel that he kept inventing excuses to revisit Florence. When he had traveled on the Santa Fe the previous year, the management of the refreshment rooms was shocking, Townsend wrote. But now that Fred had taken over and installed Bill Phillips, the food was splendid, with fish and game breakfasts, dinners, and suppers that were marvels of luxury and neatness, suited to the most exigent or Epicurean taste. He would often find himself in another western city in a cramped hotel room with a nasty bed, wondering if it was possible to reach Florence and our compatriot Phillips in time for breakfast. You might say that St. Kames was an early version of those popular travel influencers with large audiences on YouTube in our time who travel around the world and create glowing video reports to put on their YouTube channel with gorgeous photos of hotels and restaurants and resorts they frequent, in the hopes that the venues they promote will pay them handsomely, either in cash or in free food or lodging and amenities the next time they are in the area. But what about regular people, local residents of Florence or travelers on the Santa Fe Railroad who stopped by the Fred Harvey restaurant and attached hotel? What did they think of this beautiful little jewel of an oasis sitting in the middle of nowhere of the dusty, grungy Old West, with European-style cuisine and Irish linen napkins and tablecloths? Stephen Fried makes it very clear in his book that this oasis made a big splash with everyone. The Florence Depot Hotel quickly became so successful that its rooms were constantly sold out. Since it was only 100 miles from the main office in Topeka, Santa Fe executives brought their wives and clients there. Locals were so enthralled with the food that they were able to overcome their annoyance at train passengers receiving preferential treatment. While the restaurant was open to the public, all service to local customers was put on hold whenever a Santa Fe train approached, which happened 5 times a day, sometimes on schedule, sometimes not. The number of train passengers planning to eat in the dining room or the lunchroom was telegraphed ahead from the previous station, and their places were set for them before the train arrived. If too many local people were dining at the time, some were asked to give up their seats. The others had to wait until the passengers had eaten before being served. Local patronage was important, but above all else, the trains had to be fed. Fred was so impressed by how quickly Bill Phillips made a major impact on his business that he decided to give him a contract and a share of the profits. The deal reportedly made Phillips the best paid man in Florence, earning more than even the local bank president. With Phillips in place, Fred expanded the Florence Hotel and Restaurant even further, adding not only more dining space, but also offices, hotel rooms, and large sample rooms where traveling salesmen could show their lines to local customers. He also gave the place a proper name. Instead of the Santa Fe Depot Hotel and Eating House, it would now be known by the more elegant appellation, the Clifton. Fountains and a new sign were installed out front. Inside were luxuries Florentines had yet to enjoy, even indoor plumbing. Every Tuesday and Friday, the ladies of Florence can have use of the bathrooms at the Clifton Hotel, the Herald proudly announced. This will be a luxury which will be duly appreciated. All other days, the bathrooms are open to gentlemen. I'm pretty sure that by bathrooms, they didn't mean just rooms with toilets. They even let locals reserve a chance to bathe in a regular bathtub with running water as if they were at a spa. Yes, when Fred Harvey arrived in the Old West in the mid-1800s, the amenities of food and lodging available to the railroad traveling public in the western U.S. was primarily miserable at best and hellish at worst. It took him a few years to find where his skill set and ambitions could make a difference and make him a prosperous living. But with the success of his first experiment in setting a higher standard, of reinventing the lunchroom at the Topeka Santa Fe Railroad Station, things began looking up. and with the even greater and more extensive experiment he embarked on in Florence, Kansas, with the help of Master Chef Bill Williams, turning a rundown train depot restaurant and dumpy hotel in a tiny burg in rural Kansas into a dignified, classy, popular destination for middle and upper class tourists, Fred Harvey was on an upward trajectory toward his destiny that never slowed down from then on. In the next episode in this series, we'll all climb aboard the next Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe train to travel the next stretch of track in Fred Harvey's saga, where we will watch him add one of the ingredients to the higher standard he was setting in place. When we meet the Harvey girls.